So my name is Jason Smerdon. I'm a Lamont research professor at the Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory of Columbia University. I've been working at Lamont for almost 13 years. I started in 2005. I came as a postdoc and then have stayed on in various capacities since then. I'm a climate scientist and I'm interested in how the climate has varied over decades to centuries. We study climate over the last several millennia, and we use the information that we garner from our studies of climate over those time periods to tell us about how the climate naturally varies on these time scales, how things that cause climate to change like volcanoes and solar variability create changes on decades to centuries. And ultimately what we'd like to understand is how that perspective in the past can allow us to understand the kinds of changes that we expect in the future. My job is to synthesize data from all over the world that's collected through the painstaking work of scientists in lots of different disciplines who are out collecting tree ring cores or ice cores or samples from corals. And what I do is take all of that information and try to put together a coherent global or regional picture from all of those different records. So a lot of my focus is on the statistical techniques that we use to put all of those records together to try to paint more spatially consistent pictures. You can think of them as maps of how the climate has varied back over several thousand years. So think of the radar image that you get from weather reports and the way that those weather patterns are represented in space over maybe the United States or over larger regions. We're trying to create similar things in the sense that we want to create annual or seasonal maps of different climate conditions, but we want to extend that over periods of thousands of years. The climate is currently undergoing profound changes that are largely caused by human activities. Most importantly, the increase of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution is accelerating and causing massive changes in the climate system that we're going to have to adapt to, in part, as well as try to mitigate the worst consequences of increasing emissions and the subsequent responses in the climate system. So right now, understanding where we're going in the context of climate change is a fundamental problem facing all of humankind. The other aspect of that problem is that we really only have reliable instrumental data like temperature measurements that go back, let's say, 100 to 150 years in a way that's extensive enough that we can understand how things work globally. But the climate varies over time periods longer than 100 to 150 years. There's things that it does over decades to centuries that aren't well represented in that 100 to 150 year instrumental interval. And so if we want to know something about how climate changes outside of that very short interval, we have to have ways of estimating how the climate might vary in the future by using the past to inform that. So what's unique about using things like tree rings and ice cores, the records that give us high resolution information, is we actually can estimate what the climate was like over a season or a year, and we can piece that together back in time, and it really gives us the best estimate of how climate varies on these yearly to decadal to centennial timescales over the last several thousand years. And so understanding how things have changed in the past gives us a broader picture of how the climate can change, how it's responded to different factors in the past like volcanoes and solar variability, and that gives us information on how we can expect the climate to change in the future under these very rapid changes that we're causing. So what I think is really exciting about the NSF PIRE Create project is that it allows us to connect with universities here in the United States as well as universities in South America. And these kinds of collaborative interactions are really essential to our science, because no one of us working on this project could do everything on the project. It takes people who are working in the field, it takes people who are collecting specific kinds of data and comparing those data like tree rings to the speleothem data that are being collected. And each of those areas represents specific domain experts that have their own area of expertise, their own networks for collecting data, and so on. And then there are people like me who are working more on the modeling and analysis side of things that also bring my own specific expertise to the table. And what that creates is a real rich collaboration that none of us could achieve in isolation. And the other thing that's really exciting about the PIRE Create project is that we're bringing in a lot of graduate students and postdocs to work within this project. And so not only are we doing a lot of exciting science, and I think we're going to answer some really interesting questions, but we're engaging the next generation in doing that. And so it will create people who are trained beyond just our own disciplines. So some of the students that I'll work with and the postdocs that I'll work with will be doing some of the computer analysis and modeling, but they'll also learn something about how the individual data are collected, how the tree rings are collected, how the speleothems are collected. And they'll have a more interdisciplinary perspective than if, for instance, I was the only one training my students and postdocs. So there's a lot of interaction and ability for cross-pollination that I think is a real important feature of the PIRE Create project. One of the biggest opportunities that it creates is the potential for exchange. So there's lots of different ways in which the project is going to bring students from South America to the United States, from the United States to South America, exchanges between the University of Albany and Columbia University here on the domestic side of the project. And there will be lots of opportunities to exchange ideas, as well as to physically go to these different places, learn about what's being done on the project in these regions in a way that I think will be profound for the students participating. In addition to the kind of research and exchange that will come about through the project and the research that we're doing, there are also summer schools that will be established in South America so that the South American students, as well as the students from the American universities, will be able to participate in and really get in the field, hands-on sense of what it takes to do the science that we do, collect the data that's being collected, and so really have a soup to nuts perspective on the collection of that data, the analyses of the data, and then the larger application of those data in the questions that we're asking. So the role that Columbia will play in the PIRE Create project is twofold. Several of us, myself included, will be working on the data analysis, large-scale reconstruction, and climate modeling side. So we'll be bringing that expertise to bear on questions about how to explain some of the observational data that we collect in South America, and how to understand some of the underlying climatic processes and dynamics that generate some of the observations that we'll be collecting. We'll also be taking some of that information and, through the use of climate models, try to translate it into understanding how we might expect the climate to change in South America going into the future. The other side of the Columbia contribution will be through our tree ring laboratory at Lamont. And we have a lot of tree ring scientists who have spent a lot of time in the field in South America, know the region well, and will be collecting a lot more tree ring data to analyze and interpret in the context of specifically hydroclimate changes or changes in the water cycle back in time over the last several thousand years. And so a lot of our tree ring scientists will be collecting more records and assisting and driving a lot of the reconstruction work from the tree ring side to better understand how the hydroclimate and the water cycle in South America has changed over the last several thousand years. So the relevance of our work to stakeholders and everyday people on the ground is that what we're trying to understand is how water resources change over time. And there's two important aspects to that. One is that, historically speaking, water precipitation availability, the incidence of droughts, these kinds of things vary on different timescales. And the picture that we often have is limited to just the 20th century in terms of how those things might change. But in many parts of the world, the kind of variability, the kind of year-to-year or decade variability that you observe when you look at things like the paleo record is that there can be many more swings up and down in terms of water availability than you might predict from the 20th century alone. So this paleo perspective, just from the angle of understanding what natural variability might bring to a region in terms of water resources, is essential, because in many cases our infrastructure isn't even up to the task of managing for those swings, let alone the kinds of changes that we expect as a consequence of climate change. And then when you add climate change on top of this, understanding how areas are going to get wetter or drier as a consequence of climate change is essential for how we manage our infrastructure, how we anticipate damage, how we manage floods, how we manage our reservoirs, how we prepare for shocks to our agricultural system. All of these things are fundamentally tied to water and water availability, and that's fundamentally what we're trying to understand. How will water over various parts, in this case South America, change both in time and in space? How historically has it changed, and how can we better understand that? And then how do we expect it to change going into the future with this huge human-caused signal through the increase of greenhouse gases that is expected to profoundly change the way that water is distributed across the planet? A lot of arid regions are going to get drier. In many cases, the storms that we do get will be more severe and drop larger amounts of water on land through those events. And so understanding how all of that varies and is expected to vary in the future is fundamental for how we plan and how we do business, how we do agriculture, all those things related to water on the ground. The availability of water affects us all, and you don't necessarily have to be in the region that's impacted by something like a drought to feel the effects. A good example here in the United States is the California drought that persisted for 4 or 5 years a few years ago. California is really an important agricultural region for the United States. They produce a large majority of our tree nuts, a large majority of our citrus, a lot of other important crops that feed the nation and the world through these more and more connected networks of commerce and food distribution. So if a region like that is impacted by a drought, we feel it even in a place like New York City through our pocketbooks. And so in this sense, the way that water is available in places around the world, particularly through agriculture, but through other parts of our economy and our infrastructure and our recreation, all of these things that are connected, really depend on the water that we get, how it's going to change in the future, and whether or not we're going to have more or less of it in important regions.